In the fall of 1981, two siblings vanished after school in the quiet town of Willow Creek, Oregon, leaving behind an empty playground and a community gripped by fear and confusion. 12-year-old Emma and her younger brother Jack walked home like any other day, but they never arrived. Decades passed with no leads, only whispers of the Blackwood Circle, a shadowy group rumored to be connected to their disappearance. In 2023, a newly uncovered photograph album ignites a chilling investigation, revealing a web of secrets that could finally expose the truth behind their fate. Subscribe for more stories hidden in the dark, waiting to be brought into the light. October 15, 1981. Location: Willow Creek Elementary School, Oregon. The autumn air was crisp with the promise of winter as children poured out of Willow Creek Elementary School at 3:15 p.m., their voices echoing across the quiet residential streets lined with maple trees already beginning to turn gold and crimson. It was the kind of small Oregon town where everyone knew their neighbors' names, where front doors were left unlocked, and where the biggest excitement was usually the annual Harvest Festival. 12-year-old Emma Reynolds emerged from the red brick building with her usual purposeful stride, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that bounced as she walked. She carried her books in a worn leather satchel, a hand-me-down from her older cousin who had graduated the year before. Emma was known among her teachers as bright and inquisitive, always asking questions that went deeper than the surface of any subject. 9-year-old Jack Reynolds waited for his sister by the flagpole, as he did every day. Where Emma was confident and outgoing, Jack was quieter, more observant. He had a way of noticing things others missed. The way Mrs. Patterson's cat always sat in the same spot by the library window. How the janitor, Mr. Kowalski, hummed the same tune every afternoon while sweeping the halls. The pattern of clouds that meant rain was coming. "Ready?" Emma asked, adjusting her backpack straps. Jack nodded, falling into step beside her as they began their familiar route home. The walk took them past the old Presbyterian church with its towering steeple, through the small downtown district with its single traffic light, and across Maple Street to the residential area where their house sat on a tree-lined block. But today, they would take a different path. Emma had convinced Jack to cut through Willowbrook Park, the wooded area behind the school that served as both playground and nature preserve. It would save them 10 minutes, she argued, and their mother wouldn't worry as long as they were home before dark. The park was quiet at this hour, most children having chosen the safer route along the sidewalks. Tall Douglas firs and ancient oaks created a canopy overhead, filtering the afternoon sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. A narrow dirt path wound through the trees, connecting the school grounds to the residential streets on the other side. Emma and Jack had walked this route a dozen times before, but something felt different today. The usual sounds of the forest, birdsong, rustling leaves, the distant hum of traffic, seemed muted, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. "Do you hear that?" Jack asked, stopping suddenly. Emma paused, listening. In the distance, barely audible, came the sound of voices. Adult voices, speaking in low, urgent tones. "Probably just hikers," Emma said, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty. They continued along the path until they reached a small clearing where an old oak tree stood, its massive trunk scarred by decades of weather and time. It was here that someone had left the photograph album. The album lay at the base of the tree, its leather cover charred and blackened around the edges. Pages curled and brittle from fire damage peeked out between the covers. It looked as though someone had tried to burn it, but hadn't quite succeeded, or perhaps had been interrupted before the job was complete. Emma knelt beside the album, her journalist's curiosity already awakened even at the age of 12. "Should we look inside?" Jack hung back, something in his young mind sensing danger. "Maybe we should tell someone. A grown-up." But Emma was already lifting the cover, revealing photographs that were mostly destroyed but not entirely. Images of children, adults, gatherings in the woods, all partially obscured by fire damage but still visible enough to be disturbing. "These are pictures of kids from our school," Emma whispered, recognizing faces despite the damage. It was then that they heard the footsteps. Heavy boots on the forest floor, approaching from multiple directions. The voices they had heard earlier were getting closer, and now Emma and Jack could make out words. "The album, where is it? Someone will have found it by now. We need to retrieve it before." Emma's blood turned cold. She snapped the album shut and grabbed Jack's hand. "We need to go? Now." But as they turned to run back down the path, three figures emerged from the trees, blocking their escape route. The figures wore dark clothing and moved with purpose, their faces partially obscured by shadows cast by the forest canopy. "Children," one of them said in a voice that was unnaturally calm. "You shouldn't have seen that." Emma clutched the album to her chest, her mind racing. There was another path, one that led deeper into the woods before eventually circling back toward town. If they could reach it. "Run," she whispered to Jack. They bolted toward the trees, crashing through underbrush and low-hanging branches. Behind them, they could hear the adults giving chase, their footsteps heavy and determined. Emma's heart pounded as she led Jack through the forest, following half-remembered trails from summer camp hikes. But the woods seemed to stretch on forever, and their pursuers knew these paths better than they did. Emma realized with growing dread that they were being herded, driven away from town and towards something else entirely. The path they followed led to a dirt road where a van waited, its engine running. More adults stood beside it, and Emma recognized the symbol painted on the van's side. A twisted tree enclosed in a circle, the same symbol she had glimpsed in the damaged photographs. "It's okay," one of the adults said as they surrounded the children. "You're safe now. We're here to help." But nothing about the situation felt safe, and Emma's journalistic instinct screamed that these people were not here to help at all. The scorched photograph album fell to the ground as they were guided toward the van, its damaged pages fluttering in the autumn breeze like wounded birds trying to fly. October 15th, 1981. Location: Reynolds' family home, Willow Creek. Margaret Reynolds stood at the kitchen window, watching the street for any sign of her children. It was 4:30 p.m., well past the time Emma and Jack should have arrived home from school. The pot roast in the oven filled the house with the comforting smell of home cooking, and she had prepared their favorite after-school snack of apple slices with peanut butter. At 5 p.m., she called the school. The secretary confirmed that both children had been dismissed at the regular time and had been seen leaving the building together. By 5:30 p.m., Margaret was walking the neighborhood, knocking on doors and asking if anyone had seen Emma and Jack. The Hendersons, who lived 2 blocks over, mentioned seeing children matching their description heading toward Willowbrook Park around 3:45 p.m. At 6 p.m., Margaret called her husband Robert at work. He left his job at the lumber mill immediately and joined the search. By 7 p.m., they had contacted the police. Officer Daniel Morrison arrived at the Reynolds home as the sun was setting, painting the autumn sky in shades of orange and red. He was a young patrolman, relatively new to the force, but he took the report seriously. Missing children, even in a town as safe as Willow Creek, were always treated as priority cases. "Tell me about their usual routine," Officer Morrison said, his notebook open on the kitchen table. Margaret described the children's typical walk home from school, their responsible nature, and their strict instructions to be home before dark. "They're good kids," she said, her voice beginning to crack with worry. "They wouldn't just wander off." Robert Reynolds paced the living room, his work clothes still dusty from the mill. "Something's wrong," he kept saying. "Something's very wrong." Officer Morrison organized a search of Willowbrook Park, recruiting volunteers from the neighborhood and calling in additional officers from the county sheriff's department. They combed the woods with flashlights as darkness fell, calling the children's names until their voices grew hoarse. It was Officer Morrison himself who found the scorched photograph album at the base of the old oak tree. The leather cover was warm to the touch, as if the fire damage was recent. Inside, he discovered the disturbing images, photographs of children that appeared to have been taken at secret gatherings, adult figures whose faces were deliberately obscured, and symbols that meant nothing to him but would later prove significant. "Have you ever seen anything like this before?" he asked Margaret Reynolds, showing her the album while carefully handling it as evidence. Margaret's face went pale as she looked at the damaged photographs. "No," she whispered. "But Emma would have been curious about something like this. She's always been drawn to mysteries." October 16th, 1981. Location: Willow Creek Police Station. Chief of Police William Garrett had been hoping to retire quietly in 2 years, after serving Willow Creek for nearly 3 decades. He was a man who believed in the inherent goodness of his community, who took pride in running a department that dealt more with minor disputes and traffic violations than serious crime. The Reynolds case changed everything. Garrett spread the contents of the scorched album across his desk, studying each damaged photograph under a magnifying glass. What he saw disturbed him more than anything he had encountered in his career. These were not random snapshots, but carefully composed images that suggested ritual, ceremony, and organization. The photographs showed children of various ages, all appearing to be local, standing in circles around fires or gathered beneath trees carved with strange symbols. Adults moved in the shadows at the edges of the frames, their faces always turned away from the camera or obscured by hoods and masks. Most troubling were the notes written on the backs of some photographs, cryptic messages in a careful handwriting that spoke of harvest times, chosen ones, and the circle's promise. Garrett called the state police for assistance, requesting detectives trained in cult activities and organized crime. He also reached out to neighboring jurisdictions to inquire about similar cases or symbols. What came back chilled him to the bone. Detective Sarah Chin from the Oregon State Police arrived in Willow Creek the following day with a file folder thick with reports from across the Pacific Northwest. Similar symbols had been found at the sites of other missing children cases dating back nearly a decade. Similar photographs had been recovered from crime scenes in Washington and Northern California. You're dealing with something much larger than a local kidnapping, Detective Chin told Chief Garrett. This appears to be part of an organized network that operates across state lines. She showed him crime scene photos from a case in Bellingham, Washington, where 3 children had disappeared during a family camping trip. Investigators had found a burned-out campfire surrounded by stones arranged in a circle, with the same twisted tree symbol carved into nearby trees. Another case from Humboldt County, California, involved 2 siblings who vanished from a rural school bus stop. The only evidence found was a discarded notebook containing drawings of the twisted tree symbol and what appeared to be maps of local forests. In every case, Detective Chin explained, the children disappeared without a trace, and the only evidence left behind were these symbols and sometimes photographs like the ones you found. Chief Garrett felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. This was no longer just about finding Emma and Jack Reynolds. It was about uncovering a conspiracy that had been operating in the shadows for years. November 1981 to March 1982. Location: Pacific Northwest Regional Investigation. The investigation expanded rapidly as law enforcement agencies across 3 states began sharing information and coordinating their efforts. A joint task force was established with Detective Chin as the lead investigator, bringing together experts in cult behavior, organized crime, and missing persons cases. The pattern that emerged was both sophisticated and disturbing. The group responsible for the disappearances operated under the name Blackwood Circle, apparently taking its identity from an abandoned logging town in the Oregon Cascades where some of the earliest incidents had occurred. The Blackwood Circle appeared to be structured like a religious cult, with local cells operating independently but following the same rituals and hierarchies. Members used the twisted tree symbol as their identifier and gathered at remote locations for ceremonies that investigators believed involved the abduction and indoctrination of children. Evidence suggested that the circle had been active since at least the mid-1970s, possibly longer. Members were believed to include respected community figures, business owners, clergy, teachers, people whose positions gave them access to children and credibility within their communities. The investigation revealed a sophisticated recruitment and indoctrination process. Children were initially observed and evaluated at public gatherings, school events, community festivals, church activities. Those deemed suitable for the circle's purposes were gradually isolated through carefully orchestrated encounters, often involving staged rescues from manufactured dangers. Once in the circle's control, children underwent a process the group called enlightenment, psychological conditioning designed to erase their previous identities and bind them to the cult's belief system. Survivors from other cases described being told that their families no longer existed, that the outside world was dangerous and corrupt, and that the circle was their only true home. Physical evidence was maddeningly scarce. The circle operated with military-like precision, leaving few traces of their activities. Meeting sites were carefully chosen and thoroughly cleaned after use. Members communicated through coded messages and rarely met in groups larger than 5 or 6 people. The breakthrough came in February 1982, when a routine traffic stop in southern Oregon led to the arrest of a man carrying forged identification and a briefcase full of circle documents. Harold Pemberton, age 47, had been stopped for speeding but became agitated when asked to step out of his vehicle. Inside Pemberton's car, investigators found maps of remote forest areas, photographs of children, and most importantly, a detailed organizational chart showing the structure of circle cells across 4 states. The documents revealed that the Blackwood Circle was far larger and more organized than anyone had suspected. Pemberton's interrogation yielded crucial intelligence about the circle's operations, but it also revealed the scope of their influence within law enforcement and local government. Several investigations had been mysteriously terminated or misdirected, evidence had disappeared from police storage facilities, and key witnesses had been intimidated into silence. "They have people everywhere," Pemberton warned Detective Chin during one of their sessions. "Judges, police officers, school administrators. You think you're investigating them, but they've been watching you since the day you opened that album." March 1982. Location: Echo Rock Compound, Oregon Cascades. The raid on Echo Rock was planned with military precision, involving federal agents, state police, and specially trained tactical units. The compound was located in a remote valley 30 miles east of Willowbrook Park, accessible only by a network of unmarked logging roads. Detective Chin led the ground team while helicopters provided aerial surveillance and backup. They approached at dawn, hoping to catch the compound's inhabitants before they could destroy evidence or escape into the surrounding wilderness. What they found was a sophisticated operation that had clearly been in use for years. The main compound consisted of several buildings arranged around a central meeting area where the twisted tree symbol was carved into an enormous stone altar. Dormitory-style housing could accommodate dozens of children, while administrative buildings contained detailed records of the circle's activities dating back to 1975. But the compound was empty. Recent signs of habitation, warm ashes and fire pits, fresh tire tracks, food still in refrigerators, suggested that the evacuation had happened within the previous 24 hours. "They knew we were coming," Chin said grimly as her team processed the scene. The evidence left behind was both extensive and heartbreaking. Personal belongings of missing children from across the region were found stored in labeled containers. Photographs documented the indoctrination process, showing children in various stages of psychological breakdown and conditioning. Medical records indicated that children were drugged during the initial stages of their captivity to make them more compliant. Most disturbing were the education materials, textbooks and workbooks designed to systematically erase children's memories of their previous lives while indoctrinating them into the circle's belief system. The materials spoke of the outside world as corrupt and dangerous, of families as false constructs, and of the circle as humanity's only hope for survival. Among the recovered items were personal effects belonging to Emma and Jack Reynolds, Emma's leather school satchel and Jack's favorite baseball cap. DNA testing confirmed that both children had been at the compound, but there was no indication of where they might have been taken when the site was evacuated. The investigation of Echo Rock took weeks, with forensic teams cataloging thousands of pieces of evidence. What emerged was a clear picture of the Blackwood Circle as a highly organized criminal enterprise that had been operating across multiple states for at least 7 years. But it also became clear that Echo Rock was not the only compound. Documents found at the site referenced other locations, places with names like Haven's Rest, Sanctuary Hills, and New Eden, suggesting that the circle operated an entire network of facilities. 1982 to 2000. Location: various investigation sites. The investigation into the Blackwood Circle consumed Detective Chin's career over the next 18 years. As leads were pursued across multiple states and new evidence emerged, the true scope of the organization became apparent. The circle operated as a decentralized network with cells in Oregon, Washington, California, Idaho, and Montana. Each cell was largely autonomous but followed the same basic structure and rituals. At its peak, investigators estimated that the organization may have included several hundred active members and had been responsible for the disappearance of more than 50 children. The group's ideology was a mixture of environmental extremism, anti-government sentiment, and apocalyptic religious beliefs. Members believed that modern society was corrupt beyond redemption, and that the circle was preserving a select group of pure individuals who would rebuild civilization after an inevitable collapse. Children were seen as particularly valuable because they could be shaped and molded before being corrupted by outside influences. The circle's leaders claimed that by removing children from their families and communities, they were actually saving them from lives of meaningless suffering. Over the years, several other compounds were discovered and raided, yielding additional evidence and occasionally recovering survivors. Each raid revealed more about the circle's methods and structure, but the leadership always seemed to stay one step ahead of law enforcement. Some children were recovered and reunited with their families, though many suffered from severe psychological trauma that required years of therapy to address. Others had been so thoroughly indoctrinated that they refused to cooperate with authorities and demanded to be returned to the Circle. A few brave souls who had escaped from Circle custody came forward with testimony that helped investigators understand the group's methods. They described a systematic process of psychological abuse designed to break down individual identity and replace it with absolute loyalty to the Circle. Children were told that their families had abandoned them or been killed. They were given new names and new identities within the Circle's hierarchy. Those who resisted were subjected to isolation, sleep deprivation, and other forms of psychological torture until they submitted. But Emma and Jack Reynolds remained missing, their fate unknown despite years of investigation and dozens of raids on Circle properties. 2000 to 2023. Location: Willow Creek, Oregon. As the 1990s gave way to the new millennium, the active investigation into the Blackwood Circle gradually wound down. Many of the original investigators had retired or moved on to other cases. The organization seemed to have gone dormant, with no new disappearances matching their established patterns and no fresh intelligence about their activities. Chief Garrett retired in 1995, passing the unsolved Reynolds case to his successor along with boxes of evidence and a thick file of reports. Detective Chun moved to a federal position with the FBI, where she continued to track cult activities but was assigned to newer, more active cases. The town of Willow Creek slowly healed from the trauma of 1981, though the memory of Emma and Jack Reynolds never entirely faded. Their photographs appeared on missing children posters well into the 1990s, and their case was featured on several television programs devoted to unsolved mysteries. Margaret and Robert Reynolds divorced in 1985, their marriage unable to survive the stress and grief of their children's disappearance. Margaret remained in Willow Creek, keeping the family home exactly as it had been when Emma and Jack vanished, hoping against hope that they might someday return. Robert moved to Portland, where he remarried and tried to build a new life. Margaret never remarried. She became involved with missing children's advocacy groups and spoke at conferences about the need for better coordination between law enforcement agencies. She kept every piece of correspondence from investigators, every new lead that emerged, every false alarm that raised and then dashed her hopes. The scorched photograph album that had been found at the base of the oak tree was returned to the family in 1985 when the active investigation was scaled back. Margaret couldn't bear to look at it, wrapping it in cloth and storing it in the attic along with other painful reminders of her lost children. Years passed. Margaret's hair turned gray, then white. Her siblings urged her to move away from Willow Creek, to start fresh somewhere without constant reminders of her loss. But she refused, saying that Emma and Jack would need to know where to find her when they came home. In 2019, Margaret Reynolds suffered a massive stroke that left her partially paralyzed and unable to live independently. She spent her final years in a nursing home, surrounded by photographs of Emma and Jack at various ages, the real ones from before their disappearance, and computer-generated projections of how they might look as adults. When Margaret died in July 2023, at the age of 84, she left behind a house full of memories and a mystery that had consumed her entire adult life. July 2023. Location: Reynolds family home, Willow Creek. Maya Collins had not intended to become involved in her family's darkest mystery. At 32, she was a successful investigative journalist based in Portland, specializing in corporate corruption and environmental crimes. She had grown up hearing whispered stories about her missing cousins, but those tales had always seemed like fragments from another lifetime. Maya was the daughter of Robert Reynolds' brother Michael, who had left Willow Creek for college in 1979 and never returned. Michael had shared only the barest details of Emma and Jack's disappearance with his daughter, preferring to let the past remain buried. But when Margaret Reynolds died and left her estate to be divided among the surviving family members, Maya found herself tasked with sorting through decades of accumulated possessions. The house on Elm Street was exactly as Margaret had left it, a shrine to the missing children, frozen in time like a museum dedicated to loss. Emma's room still contained her collection of Nancy Drew books and her journal filled with stories and observations. Jack's room held his baseball cards and model airplanes, gathering dust on shelves that had waited 42 years for his return. It was in the attic that Maya made the discovery that would change everything. The scorched photograph album was wrapped in a faded quilt, tucked away behind boxes of Christmas decorations and old furniture. Maya almost overlooked it entirely, but something about the careful way it had been packaged suggested importance. When she unwrapped the album and saw the fire damage, her journalist's instincts immediately awakened. This was evidence, carefully preserved despite being too painful to examine. The photographs inside were mostly destroyed, but enough remained to tell a story: images of children, adults, gatherings in forest settings, and repeatedly, the symbol of a twisted tree enclosed in a circle. Maya spent hours examining the album under various lighting conditions, using techniques she had learned while investigating document fraud cases. What she discovered were layers of information hidden beneath the obvious damage: faint handwriting on the backs of photographs, symbols that appeared to be part of a larger code, and most importantly, evidence that this album was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Her investigation began with a simple Google search for Blackwood Circle, which yielded thousands of results. The case had become part of internet folklore, discussed on forums devoted to unsolved mysteries and conspiracy theories. But buried within the speculation and wild theories were nuggets of genuine information, testimonies from survivors, research by amateur investigators, and most importantly, evidence that the circle's influence had extended far beyond what law enforcement had ever uncovered. Maya realized that she possessed something unique, a primary piece of evidence from one of the most mysterious criminal cases of the late 20th century, combined with the investigative skills and resources to finally uncover the truth. She requested a leave of absence from her job and moved temporarily to Willow Creek, renting a small apartment within walking distance of the house where Emma and Jack had lived. Her mission was simple: to find out what had happened to her cousins and to bring their story into the light after more than 4 decades of darkness. August 2023. Location: Willow Creek, Oregon. Maya's first step was to track down the surviving investigators from the original case. Detective Sarah Chun, now 67 and retired from the FBI, was living in Bend, Oregon, where she ran a consulting firm specializing in cult deprogramming and survivor support. When Maya called and explained who she was, Chun's response was immediate. "I've been waiting for this call for 20 years. They met at a coffee shop in downtown Bend, where Chun brought 3 boxes of files she had maintained on the Blackwood Circle case throughout her career. The official investigation had been closed in 2000, but Chun had never stopped collecting information about the organization and its activities. The case never really ended, Chun explained as she spread photographs and reports across their table. The circle went underground, but they didn't disappear. I've been tracking incidents that match their patterns for decades. Children who vanish from rural areas, symbols found at crime scenes, witness reports of organized groups operating in wilderness areas. Chun's files contained evidence that the Blackwood Circle had evolved and adapted over the years, becoming more sophisticated in their methods and more careful about avoiding detection. The organization had apparently learned from the raids of the 1980s, developing better operational security and limiting their exposure to law enforcement. "They're still out there," Chun said, pointing to a map dotted with red pins indicating suspected circle activities. "Different leadership, probably different methods, but the same basic organization. They've learned to be patient, to plan more carefully, to limit their activities to avoid drawing attention." Chun shared intelligence about suspected circle operations in remote areas of Oregon, Washington, and Northern California. Most of the reports came from hikers or hunters who had encountered strange gatherings in the wilderness, groups of adults and children engaging in ritualistic activities around fires marked with familiar symbols. "The problem is that we can never get close enough to gather evidence," Chun explained. "They have lookouts, early warning systems, probably people inside local law enforcement agencies. Every time we think we've found a lead, it evaporates before we can act on it." Maya studied the map of suspected activities, noting how many incidents had occurred within a 100-mile radius of Willow Creek. "You think they're still operating in this area?" Chun nodded grimly. "I think Willow Creek was important to them, maybe even their original base of operations. The fact that Emma and Jack were taken from here suggests this was more than just a target of opportunity. This was their home territory." She handed Maya a folder containing the most recent intelligence reports. "There have been 3 unexplained disappearances in this region over the past 5 years. All children, all from rural or isolated areas, all leaving behind minimal evidence. The local authorities treat them as separate cases, but I see the patterns. As their meeting concluded, Chen offered Maya something that no other investigator had ever possessed, a direct connection to one of the Circle survivors. Her name is Sarah Mills, Chen said, writing a phone number on a slip of paper. She escaped from a Circle compound in 1987 and has been in hiding ever since. She's never spoken publicly about her experiences, but she might be willing to talk to you. Your family, that might make the difference. August 2023. Location: Bend, Oregon. Sarah Mills lived in a small house on the outskirts of Bend, surrounded by a garden that seemed designed more for privacy than beauty. Tall hedges blocked the view from the street, and security cameras were mounted at strategic points around the property. When Maya arrived for their meeting, Sarah greeted her at the door with the wary expression of someone who had spent decades looking over her shoulder. Now in her early 50s, Sarah had the prematurely aged appearance of someone who had seen too much too young. Detective Chen said you were family, Sarah said as she led Maya into a living room dominated by bookshelves and security monitors. Emma and Jack's cousin? Maya nodded, pulling out the scorched photograph album. I found this in my aunt's attic. I'm trying to understand what happened to them. Sarah's expression changed when she saw the album. She handled it carefully, her fingers tracing the fire damage, as if she recognized the specific pattern of burns. I remember this, she said quietly. Or one just like it. They used albums like this to document their activities, proof of their power, records of their successes. Sarah's story unfolded slowly, punctuated by long pauses as she struggled with memories she had spent decades trying to suppress. She had been 7 years old when the Circle took her from a camping trip with her family in the Oregon Cascades. Her parents and younger brother had been killed, though she didn't learn this until years later. They told us our families didn't want us anymore, Sarah explained. That we had been chosen for something special, something important. They gave us new names, new identities within their system. I was Little Bird for 6 years. The Circle's indoctrination process was systematic and thorough. Children were isolated from any reminders of their previous lives and subjected to a daily routine designed to break down their individual personalities and rebuild them as loyal servants of the organization. They used a combination of drugs, sleep deprivation, sensory manipulation, and psychological conditioning, Sarah continued. But the most effective tool was fear of abandonment, fear of punishment, fear of the outside world they taught us was dangerous and corrupt. Children who resisted were subjected to increasingly severe punishments until they submitted. Those who showed aptitude for the Circle's teachings were given privileges and elevated within the organization's hierarchy. Emma and Jack were there when I arrived, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Emma was fighting them, asking questions, trying to help the younger children remember their real names. Jack was quieter, but he was watching everything, learning their patterns. Maya's heart raced as she realized she was hearing the first eyewitness account of her cousin's fate. How long were they there? What happened to them? Sarah closed her eyes, clearly struggling with the memories. The Circle moved children around between different facilities based on their level of conditioning and their usefulness to the organization. Emma was eventually transferred because she was considered too influential among the other children. Jack. She paused, taking a shaky breath. Jack was selected for something they called the Advanced Program. The Advanced Program, according to Sarah, was reserved for children who showed particular intelligence or capability. These children received specialized training and were eventually integrated into the Circle's operational structure as junior members. I last saw them in the spring of 1984, Sarah said. There was a ceremony. They called it a graduation. Emma and Jack were taken to another facility, somewhere they said was more important, more secure. Sarah had escaped during a transfer between facilities in 1987 when the vehicle transporting her broke down on a remote mountain road. She had managed to slip away during the confusion and had spent days walking through the wilderness before being found by a search and rescue team. I never spoke about what I had experienced, Sarah said. The Circle had people everywhere, police officers, social workers, judges. I was terrified that they would find me and take me back. So I kept quiet, changed my name, moved frequently, tried to disappear. But Sarah had never stopped thinking about the children she had left behind, including Emma and Jack. Over the years, she had tried to track down information about the Circle's other facilities, hoping to learn what had happened to her fellow captives. From Sarah, Maya received copies of journals and drawings that Sarah had created from memory, detailed layouts of circle facilities, descriptions of their daily routines, and most importantly, a map showing the locations of compounds that Sarah had either visited or heard described by other children. There were at least a dozen major facilities, Sarah explained, pointing to marks on her hand-drawn map. Echo Rock was just one of them. The circle operated like a corporation, with specialized centers for different purposes: recruitment, initial conditioning, advanced training, and what they called final integration. As Maya prepared to leave, Sarah offered one final piece of information that would prove crucial to the investigation. "There's someone else you need to talk to," she said, writing a name and address on a slip of paper. Carol Simmons. She worked at the post office in Willow Creek during the 1980s, and she saw things: mail coming and going, packages, correspondence. She never spoke up at the time because she was afraid, but she might be willing to talk now. September 2023. Location: Willow Creek, Oregon. Carol Simmons was 78 years old and living in a senior community on the outskirts of Willow Creek. When Maya contacted her, Carol was initially reluctant to discuss the past, but eventually agreed to meet after Maya explained her family connection to the case. "I've carried this guilt for 40 years, Carol said as they sat in her small apartment surrounded by photographs of grandchildren and great-grandchildren. "I saw things that should have been reported, but I was scared of losing my job, scared of what might happen to my own family." During the early 1980s, Carol had worked the evening shift at the Willow Creek Post Office, which gave her access to mail and packages that passed through the facility outside of normal business hours. She had noticed unusual patterns in the mail: large volumes of correspondence going to post office boxes registered under names that didn't match any local residents, packages arriving from remote locations with no return addresses, and most significantly, financial transactions that suggested large amounts of money were flowing through accounts tied to these mysterious addresses. There were names that kept appearing, Carol explained, showing Maya a list she had compiled from memory. H. Pemberton, M. Thornfield, E. Blackwood, names that appeared on money orders, registered letters, package deliveries. But none of these people had local addresses or phone numbers. Carol had also observed a pattern of activity around certain post office boxes. Men would arrive to collect mail at irregular hours, always paying in cash and never engaging in conversation with postal workers. These individuals often carried multiple sets of identification and seemed to be collecting mail for several different names. "I started keeping notes," Carol said, producing a small notebook filled with dates, times, and observations. "I thought maybe I would report it to someone eventually, but I never knew who to trust." The people collecting this mail looked respectable: businessmen, church leaders, people who held positions of authority in the community. The notes Carol had kept provided a crucial link between the Blackwood Circle's activities and Willow Creek's business and social establishment. Many of the names she had recorded matched individuals who had been identified as suspects in Detective Chin's investigation, but who had never been prosecuted due to lack of evidence. Most significantly, Carol's record showed a dramatic increase in suspicious mail activity during the weeks leading up to Emma and Jack's disappearance, followed by an equally dramatic decrease afterward. As if the organization had shifted its operations elsewhere following the heightened attention from law enforcement. "There was one package that arrived 3 days after the children went missing," Carol said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It was addressed to E. Blackwood, and it was heavy, felt like it might contain books or papers. But what I remember most was the return address. It was from somewhere called New Eden Research Foundation in Northern California." Maya made careful notes as Carol continued her account. The New Eden Research Foundation had appeared on several packages over the years, always sending materials to the same network of post office boxes used by suspected Circle members. "I looked it up once, years later when the internet became available," Carol continued. The New Eden Research Foundation was supposedly a think tank focused on environmental issues and sustainable living. But their address was a remote compound in the mountains near the Oregon border, the kind of place where you could hide a small army. Carol's records also revealed another disturbing pattern: packages and letters addressed to children, using names that didn't match any local families. These items were always collected by the same group of adults who handled the other suspicious mail. "I think they were maintaining contact with the children they had taken," Carol said. "Sending them materials, maybe instructions or propaganda. It was like they were running a correspondence school for kidnapped kids." As their meeting concluded, Carol handed Maya a manila envelope she had kept hidden for 40 years. "I made copies of some of the addresses and names I saw repeatedly," she said. I always thought someday I might need them as evidence. Maybe that day has finally come. Inside the envelope were photocopies of mail records, package receipts, and Carol's handwritten notes documenting suspicious activities at the post office. Most importantly, there was a complete list of post office box numbers that had been rented under false names, along with the dates when they had been active. September 2023. Location: Oregon State Archives, Salem. Armed with Carol's information and Sarah's memories, Maya began a systematic investigation of the Blackwood Circle's paper trail. She started with the Oregon State Archives, where business registration records from the 1970s and 1980s were stored in climate-controlled warehouses. The New Eden Research Foundation had indeed been a registered nonprofit organization, incorporated in California in 1976 and maintaining a branch office in Oregon from 1979 to 1985. The organization's stated mission was advancing human understanding of sustainable living practices and environmental stewardship. But the list of board members and major donors revealed connections to individuals who had been identified as Circle suspects. Maya spent days poring over corporate filings, tax records, and property transactions. What emerged was a complex web of interconnected organizations, all sharing similar environmental and social justice missions, all operating from remote locations, and all connected through overlapping leadership and funding sources. The Circle appeared to have operated as much more than a simple cult. It was a sophisticated network of organizations that generated substantial revenue through various enterprises. They operated organic farms, sold handicrafts and artwork, ran wilderness therapy programs, and even maintained contracts with government agencies for environmental cleanup projects. They were hiding in plain sight, Maya realized as she traced the connections between various organizations. They presented themselves as environmentalists and social activists, which gave them credibility and access to funding. The financial records revealed that the Circle had access to millions of dollars in revenue, much of which was funneled through a maze of nonprofit organizations and shell companies. This money funded their network of compounds, supported their recruitment activities, and allowed them to maintain sophisticated operational security. Maya also discovered property records showing that Circle-affiliated organizations had purchased land across the Pacific Northwest, remote parcels and mountainous areas that would be perfect for hidden compounds. Many of these properties were still owned by the same organizations, suggesting that the Circle's infrastructure remained intact even if their activities had gone underground. October 2023. Location: Humboldt County, California. Maya's investigation led her to Northern California, where property records indicated that the New Eden Research Foundation had owned a 500-acre compound in the remote mountains east of Eureka. The property had been sold in 1987, shortly after the major law enforcement raids on Circle facilities, but the new owners had maintained it as a spiritual retreat center. The drive to the former compound took Maya through increasingly remote territory, following narrow mountain roads that wound through dense forests of redwoods and Douglas firs. The isolation was profound: no cell phone coverage, no other traffic, just an endless canopy of trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. The compound itself was larger and more sophisticated than Maya had expected. What had once been the New Eden Research Foundation was now called Harmony Hills Retreat, and it operated as a legitimate business offering meditation workshops, yoga retreats, and environmental education programs. Maya posed as a journalist researching sustainable living communities and arranged for a tour of the facilities. Her guide was a woman named Jennifer Walsh, who had purchased the property from the foundation in 1987 and spent decades transforming it from what she described as a rather dark and secretive organization into an open, welcoming community. The previous owners were very strange, Jennifer explained as they walked through dormitory buildings that had clearly once housed large numbers of people. They had built all these facilities for children, classrooms, dormitories, even a medical clinic, but they were very secretive about their actual activities. Jennifer led Maya to a building that had been the foundation's administrative center, now converted into workshop space for pottery and woodworking. When we bought the place, there were rooms full of files and documents that the previous owners had left behind. Thousands of pages of records, photographs, even audio recordings. Maya's heart raced. What happened to those materials? We kept some of the historical documents, the property deeds, construction records, that sort of thing, Jennifer replied. But most of it was disturbing material that we didn't want to preserve. Children's files, psychological evaluations, what looked like medical experiments. We turned it all over to the FBI when they came asking about it in the early 1990s. Jennifer showed Maya through the rest of the compound, pointing out modifications that had been made over the years. The original layout revealed a facility designed for control and surveillance, dormitories with minimal privacy, common areas that could be easily monitored, and an administrative section that had clearly been built to house extensive record-keeping operations. There was one building that gave us the creeps, Jennifer said, leading Maya to a structure that had been converted into a meditation hall. It was set up like a classroom, but there were restraint systems built into the furniture and what looked like medical equipment for administering drugs or other treatments. The building Jennifer described matched Sarah Mills' recollections of the conditioning centers, where new arrivals were processed and indoctrinated into circle beliefs. As the tour concluded, Jennifer offered Maya access to the historical documents that had been preserved from the New Eden Foundation era. "I've always wondered what really happened here," she said. "Maybe it's time someone finally told that story." October 2023. Location: Harmony Hills Retreat, California. The documents Jennifer Walsh had preserved from the New Eden Research Foundation filled 3 large storage boxes and provided the most detailed look yet into the Blackwood Circle's operations. Maya spent several days at the retreat, carefully cataloging and photographing hundreds of pages of organizational records, financial statements, and correspondence. What emerged was a picture of an organization that operated with corporate-level sophistication and planning. The Circle maintained detailed records of every aspect of their operations, recruitment strategies, facility management, financial transactions, and most disturbingly, individual files on each child in their custody. The files contained psychological evaluations, medical records, educational assessments, and progress reports tracking each child's adaptation to Circle life. Maya found files for dozens of children, including several who had been reported missing from across the western United States. Among the recovered documents, Maya found files labeled Reynolds E and Reynolds J. Her hands trembled as she opened the folders and saw her cousins' faces staring back at her from decades-old photographs. Emma's file was thick with reports and evaluations. The Circle had identified her as highly intelligent but resistant to indoctrination, someone who consistently challenged authority and encouraged other children to remember their previous lives. Notes from various staff members described Emma as problematic and requiring specialized intervention. Jack's file told a different story. The evaluations described him as adaptable and intelligent, someone who quickly learned to navigate the Circle system while maintaining an internal sense of self. Several reports noted his ability to provide emotional support to other children while avoiding direct confrontation with adult authority figures. The final entries in both files were dated November 1984, more than 3 years after the children's disappearance. The last notes indicated that both Emma and Jack had been transferred to what was described as a specialized facility for advanced development, located somewhere the documents referred to only as the sanctuary. Maya also found organizational charts showing the Circle's command structure and the relationships between various facilities. The sanctuary appeared at the top of these charts, suggesting it was the organization's most important or secure location. Financial records indicated that the sanctuary received the largest allocation of resources and was staffed by the Circle's most senior personnel. But unlike the other facilities, no address or property records were included in the documents. The sanctuary's location was apparently kept secret even from other Circle operations. November 2023. Location: Portland, Oregon. Maya returned to Portland to analyze the evidence she had gathered and to consult with experts who might help her understand the Circle's operations and locate the sanctuary. She reached out to Dr. Amanda Foster, a psychologist who specialized in cult deprogramming and had worked with law enforcement agencies across the country. Dr. Foster reviewed Maya's files and provided crucial insights into the Circle's methods and likely organizational structure. "What you're describing is extremely sophisticated," Dr. Foster explained during their meeting at her Portland office. "This goes far beyond typical cult behavior into something that resembles a state-sponsored operation." The psychological techniques documented in the Circle's files suggested the involvement of professionals with advanced training in behavioral modification and mind control. The systematic approach to breaking down and rebuilding personality structures was consistent with methods developed by intelligence agencies during the Cold War. The fact that they maintained such detailed records suggests they were treating this as a research operation, Dr. Foster continued. They weren't just kidnapping children for personal gratification, They were studying the process of creating programmable human beings. Dr. Foster's analysis of the organizational charts revealed that the sanctuary likely served as both the circle's headquarters and its most advanced research facility. Children who were transferred there would have been the subjects of the most intensive conditioning and modification procedures. If your cousins were sent to the sanctuary, they would have undergone experiences that fundamentally altered their personalities and memories, Dr. Foster warned. Even if they survived, they might not remember their original identities or recognize their former family members. Based on the documents Maya had recovered, Dr. Foster estimated that the sanctuary would need to be located in an extremely remote area with access to sophisticated medical and research facilities. The facility would require substantial infrastructure, power generation, communications equipment, housing for staff and subjects, and security systems. Look for properties purchased by Circle-affiliated organizations that have unusual infrastructure requirements, Dr. Foster advised. Facilities that were supposedly for research or medical purposes but in locations that don't make sense for legitimate operations. November 2023. Location: Maya's Portland apartment. Maya spent weeks poring over property records, satellite imagery, and historical documents, searching for clues to the sanctuary's location. She created a detailed timeline of Circle activities and mapped their known facilities, looking for patterns that might reveal where their most important site was hidden. The breakthrough came when Maya discovered a series of land purchases made by a Circle-front organization called the Institute for Human Potential Development between 1982 and 1985. The Institute had bought several large parcels of land in remote areas of Oregon, Washington, and Northern California, supposedly for research facilities studying alternative approaches to human development. One property stood out from the others, a 2,000-acre tract in the Cascade Mountains of Central Oregon, purchased in 1983 for what seemed like an unusually high price. The land was located in a remote valley accessible only by helicopter or a difficult hiking trail, and it included water rights and mineral extraction permits that suggested plans for substantial development. Satellite imagery from the 1980s and 1990s showed evidence of construction on the property, buildings, roads, and what appeared to be landing facilities for aircraft. But more recent imagery showed the area returning to its natural state, with structures partially concealed by vegetation and no signs of current activity. Maya cross-referenced the property's location with reports from hikers and hunters who had encountered unusual activities in the area over the years. Several accounts described seeing children and adults in remote wilderness areas where no legitimate camps or facilities were supposed to exist. Most intriguingly, Maya found reports from the 1990s describing aircraft flying to and from the remote valley at night, using what appeared to be a private landing strip that wasn't marked on any aviation charts. This has to be the sanctuary, Maya concluded as she studied the evidence. The location, the timing of the land purchase, and the infrastructure requirements all matched what Dr. Foster had predicted for the Circle's primary facility. But accessing the site would be challenging. The property was still owned by the Institute for Human Potential Development, which continued to exist as a legal entity despite showing no signs of current activity. The land was posted with no trespassing signs and was reportedly patrolled by private security personnel. Maya needed help from someone with the resources and authority to investigate the site properly. She reached out to Detective Chin, who had maintained contacts within federal law enforcement agencies throughout her retirement. December 2023. Location: FBI Field Office, Portland. Special Agent Michael Torres had been following reports about Blackwood Circle activities for several years as part of his work with the FBI's Crimes Against Children program. When Detective Chin contacted him about Maya's investigation, he agreed to review the evidence and consider opening a new federal case. "What you've uncovered here is extraordinary," Agent Torres said after spending several hours reviewing Maya's files. "The scope and sophistication of this operation is unlike anything we've seen in domestic cult cases." The financial records Maya had recovered showed that Circle-affiliated organizations had generated tens of millions of dollars in revenue over the decades, much of which had been funneled through offshore accounts and shell companies. This suggested ongoing operations that extended far beyond the kidnapping and indoctrination activities that had originally drawn law enforcement attention. "We're looking at what appears to be a criminal enterprise that has been operating continuously for at least 40 years, Agent Torres continued. "The children may have been just one component of a much larger operation. Agent Torres explained that the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit had been tracking similar organizations across the country, groups that combined cult-like indoctrination with sophisticated financial operations and political influence. These organizations often presented themselves as legitimate research institutions or social service agencies while engaging in criminal activities behind the scenes. The problem is that these groups learn from law enforcement successes, Agent Torres said. Every time we shut down one operation, they adapt their methods and become more difficult to detect and prosecute. Based on Maya's evidence, Agent Torres agreed to seek approval for a federal investigation into the current status of Circle operations. This would involve surveillance of suspected facilities, financial investigations of Circle-affiliated organizations, and attempts to locate and interview survivors who might provide testimony about ongoing criminal activities. But I need to warn you about something, Agent Torres said as their meeting concluded. If the Circle is still active, your investigation has probably already drawn their attention. These organizations take threats to their security very seriously, and they have demonstrated a willingness to use violence to protect themselves. Agent Torres provided Maya with security recommendations and emergency contact procedures, but he also suggested that she consider stepping back from active investigation while federal authorities took over the case. Maya appreciated the warning, but she had come too far to abandon the search for answers about Emma and Jack's fate. I'll be careful, she promised, but I'm not stopping until I know what happened to my cousins. January 2024. Location: Cascade Mountains, Oregon. Against Agent Torres's advice, Maya decided to conduct her own reconnaissance of the suspected sanctuary site. She arranged for a helicopter charter under the pretense of conducting aerial photography for an environmental article, planning to survey the remote valley where the Institute for Human Potential Development owned property. The helicopter pilot, a former military aviator named Rick Morrison, was experienced in flying over remote wilderness areas and was familiar with the challenging terrain of the Central Cascades. He agreed to fly Maya over the target area, though he expressed concern about the isolated location and the lack of emergency landing sites. This is about as remote as it gets, Rick said as they lifted off from a small airport near Bend, Oregon. If we have mechanical problems out there, it's going to be a long walk back to civilization. The flight took them over increasingly rugged terrain as they headed deeper into the mountains. Dense forests gave way to steep valleys and rocky peaks, with no signs of human habitation for miles in any direction. The isolation was profound. This was the kind of place where someone could operate without any risk of casual discovery. As they approached the coordinates Maya had identified, Rick pointed to a narrow valley that appeared to contain the remnants of human construction. There's definitely something down there, he said, adjusting the helicopter's course for a closer look. Through binoculars, Maya could see the outlines of buildings partially concealed by overgrowth and camouflage netting. What had once been a substantial compound was now largely hidden from aerial view, but the basic infrastructure was still visible: roads, building foundations, and what appeared to be a landing strip suitable for small aircraft. Can you get us closer? Maya asked, trying to photograph the site with a long-range camera. Rick shook his head. I'm picking up radar signals from down there. They've got active monitoring equipment. If we get much closer, they're going to know we're here. Even from a distance, Maya could see that the site was not abandoned. There were vehicles parked near the buildings, and smoke was rising from several chimneys. Most significantly, there were people moving around the compound, adults and what appeared to be children or young adults. This place is definitely active, Maya said, her heart racing as she realized she might be looking at the current location of Circle operations. They're still using it. As Rick began to turn the helicopter away from the valley, Maya noticed something that made her blood run cold. One of the figures on the ground was pointing at their aircraft and speaking into what appeared to be a radio or communication device. We need to leave, Rick said urgently. Now. They departed the area quickly, but Maya had seen enough to confirm her suspicions. The sanctuary was not a historical site. It was an active facility where the Blackwood Circle continued to operate more than 40 years after their first known crimes. January 2024. Location: Maya's Portland apartment. The photographs Maya had taken during the helicopter reconnaissance were grainy and taken from a considerable distance, but they provided clear evidence that the suspected sanctuary site was occupied and active. She enhanced the images using professional photo editing software, revealing details that had not been obvious during the flight. The compound appeared to house dozens of people, with multiple dormitory-style buildings surrounding a central administrative complex. Vehicle tracks in the snow showed regular traffic between the buildings, and the presence of solar panels and communication equipment suggested a sophisticated operation. Most disturbing were the images that appeared to show children or young adults moving between buildings in organized groups, accompanied by adult supervisors. The level of organization and control was consistent with the institutional environment that Sarah Mills had described from her time in Circle custody. Maya immediately shared the photographs with Agent Torres, who expedited the approval process for a federal investigation. Within days, the FBI had obtained surveillance warrants and was planning a comprehensive operation to investigate current Circle activities. "This is exactly what we needed," Agent Torres told Maya during an encrypted phone call. "Proof that they're still operating and still holding people against their will. We can move forward with full federal resources. But the investigation would take time to organize properly." The remote location of the compound made surveillance difficult, and the Circle's demonstrated sophistication required careful planning to avoid alerting them to law enforcement interest. "We're talking about a major operation," Agent Torres explained. "Multiple agencies, specialized equipment, probably several months of preparation. This isn't something we can rush." Maya understood the need for careful planning, but she was haunted by the knowledge that people, possibly including her cousins, were being held at the remote facility while bureaucratic processes played out. Every day of delay meant more time for the Circle to move their operations or destroy evidence. "What if they realize they've been discovered?" Maya asked. "What if they evacuate the site before you can move?" Agent Torres acknowledged the risk, but emphasized that a poorly planned operation could result in casualties or could simply drive the Circle deeper underground. "We get one chance to do this right," he said. "If we blow it, they'll disappear and we'll never find them." February 2024. Location: Cascade Mountains, Oregon. While federal authorities planned their operation, Maya continued her own investigation into the Circle's current activities. She contacted hiking and mountaineering organizations to gather intelligence about unusual activities in the area around the suspected sanctuary site. What she learned was troubling. Over the past several years, multiple hikers and hunters had reported encounters with armed patrols in areas that were supposed to be public wilderness. These encounters typically involved groups of men who claimed to be private security personnel protecting research operations or environmental monitoring activities. Several people reported seeing aircraft flying to and from the remote valley at night, usually helicopters but occasionally small fixed-wing planes. The flights appeared to follow irregular schedules and did not show up on federal aviation tracking systems. Most significantly, Maya found reports of people who had gone missing while hiking in the area, experienced outdoors people who had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind vehicles and equipment but no signs of where they had gone. "It's like they're expanding their operations," Maya realized as she compiled the reports. "They're not just holding the people they kidnapped decades ago, they're still taking new victims." The pattern of disappearances was consistent with Circle recruitment methods that had been documented in the 1980s. The organization appeared to target isolated individuals who were unlikely to be missed immediately: solo hikers, drifters, people who were estranged from their families or communities. Maya also discovered evidence that the Circle was using modern technology to monitor and track potential victims. Several missing persons had posted their hiking plans on social media before disappearing, suggesting that the organization was using online surveillance to identify targets. The sophistication of their current operations was far beyond what law enforcement had encountered in the 1980s. The Circle had evolved into a high-tech criminal enterprise that combined traditional cult indoctrination methods with modern surveillance and communication technology. March 2024. Location: FBI Command Center, Oregon. The federal operation to investigate the sanctuary site was designated Operation Daybreak and involved coordination between the FBI, DEA, ATF, and U.S. Marshals Service. The complexity of the operation required months of planning and the deployment of specialized resources normally reserved for counterterrorism operations. Maya was brought in as a consultant to the operation, providing briefings on Circle history and methods based on her research. Her civilian status limited her direct involvement, but federal authorities recognized that her investigation had provided crucial intelligence that made the operation possible. "You've given us more actionable intelligence about this organization than law enforcement has gathered in 40 years, Agent Torres told Maya during a briefing session. "Without your work, we never would have found their current base of operations." The operation plan involved simultaneous actions at multiple sites: the sanctuary compound, several Circle-affiliated properties, and the homes or businesses of suspected organization members. The goal was to prevent the Circle from destroying evidence or relocating their operations when they realized they were under investigation. Electronic surveillance had confirmed that the sanctuary housed approximately 60 people, including what appeared to be 15 to 20 individuals under the age of 21. Many of these younger people had been at the site for years, suggesting they were long-term captives rather than recent arrivals. "We're treating this as a hostage rescue operation," Agent Torres explained. "Our primary objective is ensuring the safety of the people being held against their will. Gathering evidence and making arrests are secondary priorities." The remote location of the compound created significant logistical challenges. The site could only be accessed by helicopter or by hiking several miles through difficult terrain. The Circle had also demonstrated that they were prepared to resist law enforcement, with evidence suggesting they possessed significant firearms and had constructed defensive positions around their facilities. "This is going to be dangerous," Agent Torres warned Maya. "These people have been operating in secret for decades, and they're not going to surrender quietly." April 15, 2024. Location: Cascade Mountains, Oregon. Operation Daybreak. Operation Daybreak commenced at dawn on April 15, 2024, with coordinated raids on Circle properties across 3 states. The primary assault on the sanctuary compound involved 4 helicopters carrying federal tactical teams, while ground units moved in from multiple directions to establish a perimeter around the valley. Maya monitored the operation from a command center located at the Redmond Municipal Airport, where she could follow radio communications and receive real-time updates from the field teams. The tension was extraordinary as agents moved into position around a facility that had remained hidden from law enforcement for more than 40 years. The first sign of trouble came when the lead helicopter reported taking ground fire as it approached the compound. The Circle had prepared defensive positions and was actively resisting the federal operation with military-style weapons and tactics. "They're dug in and ready for a fight," the tactical team leader reported over the radio. "This isn't going to be quick or easy." Federal agents established a perimeter around the compound and began attempting to negotiate with Circle leaders through loudspeakers and radio communications. The response was a demand that all law enforcement personnel withdraw from the area or face escalating resistance. "They're claiming this is a religious community and that we're violating their constitutional rights," Agent Torres reported from the field command post. "But they're also threatening to harm the people inside if we don't leave." The standoff continued for several hours as federal negotiators attempted to establish communication with Circle leaders and assess the safety of the people inside the compound. Thermal imaging and other surveillance techniques revealed that many individuals were being held in what appeared to be secured areas of the facility. As the day wore on, it became clear that the Circle was prepared for a prolonged siege. They had sufficient supplies to last for weeks or months, and their defensive positions were well-planned and effectively constructed. But the breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of the younger people inside the compound managed to escape during the confusion of the initial assault and reached federal lines carrying crucial intelligence about the facility's layout and the location of people being held against their will. The escapee was a 19-year-old woman named Jennifer Hayes, who had been kidnapped from a campground in Northern California 2 years earlier. Her testimony provided federal agents with detailed information about the compound's security systems, the daily routines of the people inside, and most importantly, the location of what the Circle called their special residence. Long-term captives who were kept in a separate section of the facility. "There are people in there who have been prisoners for decades," Jennifer told Agent Torres during her debriefing. "Some of them don't even remember their real names anymore. The Circle calls them the perfected ones, people who have been completely programmed to serve the organization." April 16, 2024. Location: Sanctuary Compound Interior. Using intelligence provided by Jennifer Hayes, federal tactical teams were able to identify a secure entry point into the compound that bypassed the main defensive positions. A small team of agents infiltrated the facility during the pre-dawn hours and began locating and evacuating people who were being held against their will. What they found inside the compound was both more sophisticated and more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. The facility operated like a small city, with dormitories, workshops, educational facilities, medical clinics, and administrative offices. But every aspect of life was controlled and monitored, with surveillance cameras in every room and strict schedules governing every activity. The agents found detailed records documenting the lives of everyone in the compound, including psychological profiles, medical records, and behavior modification protocols. Many of the residents had been subjected to systematic programming designed to erase their original identities and replace them with artificial personalities that served the circle's needs. In the section of the compound reserved for special residents, agents found people who had been missing for decades, including several individuals who had been reported kidnapped as children in the 1980s and 1990s. Many of these people showed signs of severe psychological conditioning and were unable to provide coherent accounts of their experiences or even remember their original names. Among the residents was a man in his early 50s who bore a striking resemblance to Jack Reynolds, though he insisted his name was Michael and claimed to have lived at the compound his entire life. Medical records found at the site confirmed his identity through dental comparisons, revealing that this was indeed Maya's cousin, now 43 years old and showing no recognition of his previous life or family. He's been completely reprogrammed, Dr. Foster explained to Maya after examining Jack's condition. The psychological conditioning he's undergone has essentially created a new personality while suppressing all memories of his life before the circle took him. But Emma Reynolds was not found among the compound's residents. According to records discovered at the site, she had been transferred to another facility in 1987 after repeated attempts to resist the circle's programming and help other captives escape. The documents indicated that Emma had been sent to something called the Final Sanctuary, a location that even the other circle members at the compound didn't know about. References in the paperwork suggested this was where the organization sent individuals who could not be successfully programmed and who posed a continuing threat to their operations. May 2024. Location: Federal Medical Facility, Oregon. The recovery and rehabilitation of survivors from the sanctuary compound became a major federal operation involving dozens of medical professionals, psychologists, and social workers. Many of the people who had been rescued showed signs of severe psychological trauma and required extensive treatment to begin recovering their original identities. Jack Reynolds was among the most challenging cases. For decades of intensive conditioning had created an artificial personality that was completely devoted to the circle's ideology and goals. He genuinely believed that he had been born at the compound and that the outside world was dangerous and corrupt. He's going to require years of therapy, Dr. Foster explained to Maya during one of their consultations. The psychological barriers that have been constructed in his mind are extraordinarily complex. Breaking through them will be a delicate process that could take decades. Maya was allowed to visit Jack under carefully controlled conditions, but the reunion was heartbreaking rather than joyful. The man who had been her 9-year-old cousin showed no recognition of her or any memory of his life in Willow Creek. He was polite but distant, treating her like a stranger who represented a threat to his understanding of reality. "I know you think I'm someone else," Jack told Maya during one of their supervised meetings. "But Michael is who I am. I've never lived anywhere but the community, and I don't want to leave." The psychological evaluation revealed that Jack's memories of his original life had not been erased but had been buried beneath layers of artificial experiences and false memories. With proper treatment, there was hope that some of his original personality might eventually be recovered. But the process would be voluntary. Jack would have to choose to undergo the difficult and painful work of recovering his suppressed memories. As long as he remained convinced that his artificial identity was real, therapy could not proceed. Other survivors from the compound showed varying degrees of recovery potential. Some of the more recent captives, like Jennifer Hayes, retained clear memories of their lives before being taken and were able to provide valuable testimony about circle operations. Others, particularly those who had been taken as young children, showed profound psychological damage that might never be fully healed. The investigation of records found at the compound revealed that the circle had been far more active than law enforcement had suspected. Over the decades, they had kidnapped hundreds of people, operated multiple facilities across several states, and generated millions of dollars through various criminal enterprises. But the most disturbing discovery was evidence that the circle's operations extended beyond the United States. Documents found at the compound suggested connections to similar organizations in other countries, indicating that the network Maya had uncovered was part of a global criminal enterprise. June 2024. Location: FBI Field Office, Portland. The investigation into the final sanctuary, the facility where Emma Reynolds had reportedly been sent in 1987, became the FBI's top priority as agents worked to track down the remaining elements of the Circle's network. References in the compound's records suggested that this facility was even more secure and secretive than the main sanctuary site. Based on the documents we've recovered, the final sanctuary appears to be where they sent people who couldn't be successfully programmed, Agent Torres explained to Maya during a briefing session. It's described as a permanent containment facility for individuals who posed ongoing security risks to the organization. The records included references to psychological experiments conducted at the final sanctuary, suggesting that it served as a research facility where the Circle developed and tested new methods of mind control and behavior modification. Some of the techniques described in the documents were consistent with methods used in government mind control programs during the Cold War. We're looking at something that goes far beyond traditional cult activity, Agent Torres continued. This appears to be a sophisticated research operation that may have had connections to intelligence agencies or other government programs. Financial records recovered from the compound showed that the Circle had received funding from sources that were traced back to government contractors and defense industry companies. This suggested that at least some of their research activities may have been conducted under official or semi-official auspices. The search for the final sanctuary involved analyzing property records, satellite imagery, and intelligence gathered from interrogations of captured Circle members. Most of the organization's leadership had committed suicide rather than face capture, but a few lower-level members provided information about the network structure and operations. Based on this intelligence, federal investigators identified several potential locations for the final sanctuary, including remote facilities in Alaska, northern Canada, and the mountain regions of several western states. Each location would require extensive investigation to determine if it housed Circle operations. August 2024. Location: remote Alaska wilderness. The search for the final sanctuary led federal investigators to a remote location in the Alaskan wilderness, accessible only by helicopter and located more than 200 miles from the nearest settlement. Satellite imagery had revealed the presence of buildings and infrastructure that didn't match any official installations or known private operations. Maya was not permitted to participate directly in the investigation of this site due to its extreme remoteness and the potential dangers involved. But she monitored the operation from FBI headquarters, where she had been brought in as a full-time consultant on Circle-related cases. The Alaska site proved to be even more heavily fortified than the Oregon compound, with extensive underground facilities and sophisticated security systems. Unlike the sanctuary, however, this facility appeared to be largely abandoned, with evidence suggesting that it had been evacuated several months earlier. They knew we were coming, Agent Torres reported during a briefing call. The evacuation was thorough and recent, probably triggered by our operations against the main compound. The abandoned facility yielded extensive evidence about Circle operations, including detailed records of the people who had been held there over the decades. Among these records were files documenting Emma Reynolds' arrival at the facility in 1987 and her subsequent treatment over a period of nearly 20 years. According to the documents, Emma had never submitted to the Circle's programming despite years of intensive conditioning and psychological manipulation. She had repeatedly attempted to escape, had organized resistance among other captives, and had maintained her original identity despite every effort to break her will. The records showed that Emma had been subjected to increasingly extreme methods as the Circle attempted to break her resistance. Medical files documented the use of experimental drugs, sensory deprivation, and other techniques that bordered on torture. But the most significant discovery was evidence that Emma had eventually succeeded in escaping from the final sanctuary in 2006, nearly 20 years after being sent there. Security reports from that time described a carefully planned escape that had resulted in significant damage to the facility and the loss of several other captives who had apparently fled with her. She got out, Maya said, her voice trembling with emotion as Agent Torres shared the discovery. After all those years, Emma actually escaped. The security reports from 2006 painted a picture of Emma as someone who had not only maintained her resistance to Circle programming, but had actually become a leader among the other captives. Documents described her as Subject E7, a high-priority containment failure who had organized multiple escape attempts and had somehow retained detailed knowledge of the outside world despite decades of isolation. The final escape had been meticulously planned over several months. Emma had apparently recruited other long-term captives who still retained elements of their original personalities, and together they had exploited weaknesses in the facility's security systems during a routine supply delivery. According to these reports, she didn't just escape, Agent Torres continued, reading from the recovered documents. She systematically sabotaged critical systems before she left, communications equipment, security cameras, even some of the research laboratories. The damage was so extensive that they had to evacuate the entire facility for repairs. The records indicated that Emma and 4 other escapees had vanished into the Alaskan wilderness during a winter storm, taking survival equipment and supplies with them. Circle search teams had pursued them for weeks but had never found any trace of where they had gone. The question is, where did they go after they escaped? Maya asked, studying maps of the remote Alaskan regions surrounding the facility. How do you survive in that environment? And where do you go when you've been isolated from the world for 20 years? September 2024. Location: Anchorage, Alaska. Maya's investigation into Emma's escape led her to Alaska, where she began searching for any evidence of what had happened to the escapees from the final sanctuary. The task seemed nearly impossible. Alaska's wilderness was vast and unforgiving, and people could easily disappear without a trace even under the best circumstances. But Maya was no longer working alone. The FBI's investigation had attracted international attention, and law enforcement agencies from several countries were now cooperating to track down the remaining elements of the Circle's global network. This included access to resources and databases that individual investigators could never have accessed. Maya's first breakthrough came from an unexpected source: the Alaska State Troopers' Missing Persons Database. In March 2006, just weeks after Emma's escape from the final sanctuary, a small native Alaskan village called Tanana had reported the arrival of several strangers. Adults who appeared to be suffering from exposure and malnutrition but who refused to provide their names or explain where they had come from. The village elders took them in, explained Trooper Jennifer Yazzie, who had worked the case at the time. It's traditional to help people in need, especially during winter conditions. But these people were different, traumatized, like they'd been through something terrible. The strangers had stayed in Tanana for several months, slowly recovering their health and learning to interact with the outside world again. According to village records, they had eventually moved on, but not before one of them, a woman matching Emma's description, had left behind a message. Trooper Yazzie led Maya to the village, where they met with tribal elder Robert Sam, who remembered the strangers clearly despite the passage of nearly 2 decades. The woman, she was the leader, Robert recalled as they sat in his modest home overlooking the Yukon River. She was scared but strong, like someone who had been through hell but hadn't been broken by it. She asked a lot of questions about the outside world: what year it was, what had happened while she was gone, how to contact people. Robert explained that the woman had eventually told him parts of her story, how she and the others had been held captive for years at a remote facility, how they had escaped during a winter storm, and how they had survived weeks in the wilderness before finding the village. She said her real name was Emma, Robert continued, but she was afraid to use it because the people who had taken her might still be looking. She wanted to go home, but she didn't know if it was safe. Before leaving Tanana, Emma had given Robert a letter with instructions to hold it for 10 years and then give it to anyone who came looking for information about the strangers. The letter was addressed simply to my family and contained a message that made Maya's heart race with hope and anguish. September 2024. Location: Tanana, Alaska. Maya's hands trembled as Robert Sam handed her the letter Emma had left behind 18 years earlier. The envelope was yellowed with age, and Emma's handwriting on the outside was shaky but determined. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in Emma's careful script. To my family, if anyone is still looking. My name is Emma Reynolds. I was taken from Willow Creek, Oregon in October 1981 when I was 12 years old. My brother Jack was taken with me. I don't know if he's still alive, but I escaped from the place they were keeping us. If you're reading this, it means someone finally found the trail we left behind. I wanted to come home, but I don't know if it's safe. The people who took us said they had connections everywhere: police, government, even our families. I don't know what's true anymore. I'm alive and I'm free, but I don't know how to come back to a world I haven't seen for 25 years. Everything I knew is gone. Everyone I loved has probably forgotten me or thinks I'm dead. If Jack is still alive, please tell him I never stopped fighting to get back to him. Tell him I'm sorry I couldn't save him too. I'm going to try to build a new life somewhere safe. Maybe someday I'll be brave enough to come home. But for now, Just knowing that someone was still looking is enough. Love always. Emma. Maya wiped tears from her eyes as she finished reading the letter. After more than 40 years, she finally had proof that Emma had not only survived her ordeal but had retained her identity and her love for her family despite decades of psychological torture. Robert Sam watched Maya's reaction with compassionate understanding. She was a fighter, that one, he said quietly. Broken in some ways, but not defeated. She and the others, they helped around the village while they were here, worked hard, shared what they could. Good people who had been through something terrible. Maya pressed for more details about Emma's time in Tanana and where she might have gone when she left. Robert explained that Emma had spent months learning about the changes that had occurred in the world during her captivity. The internet, cell phones, the end of the Cold War, the events of September 11th. The rapid pace of technological and social change had been overwhelming for someone who had been isolated since 1981. She was particularly interested in missing children cases, Robert continued. Spent a lot of time at the community center reading old newspapers and magazines we had collected over the years. I think she was trying to understand if other families like hers had been destroyed by these people. Emma had also asked detailed questions about how to create a new identity legally, how to obtain identification documents, how to establish residency, how to find work without leaving a paper trail that could be traced back to her original name. She was planning to disappear again, Maya realized. Not because she was running from her family, but because she was still afraid of the people who had taken her. Before leaving Tanana, Emma had told Robert that she planned to travel to the lower 48 states, where she hoped to blend into a large population and build a quiet life away from anyone who might be looking for escaped circle captives. She said she might try to help other people who had been through similar experiences, Robert added. She talked about maybe working with groups that helped missing children or people escaping from cults. She felt like she had knowledge that could be useful. October 2024. Location: various cities, Pacific Northwest. Maya's search for Emma's current whereabouts became a methodical investigation spanning multiple cities across the Pacific Northwest. Working with federal authorities and using resources available through the ongoing Circle investigation, she began tracking potential leads through missing persons organizations, cult survivor support groups, and social service agencies. The search was complicated by Emma's apparent determination to remain hidden. Someone who had survived decades of captivity and sophisticated psychological manipulation would be extremely skilled at avoiding detection, especially if they believed their safety depended on anonymity. Maya's breakthrough came through an unexpected channel, a nonprofit organization in Seattle called Second Chances that provided support services for cult survivors and people escaping from organized abuse situations. The organization's director, a woman named Dr. Patricia Hendricks, had been contacted by federal investigators seeking information about potential circle survivors. We've worked with several people over the years who described experiences consistent with what you've uncovered about the circle, Dr. Hendricks explained during Maya's visit to the organization's offices. Most of them were too traumatized or afraid to speak openly about their experiences, but they found some healing through our support groups. Dr. Hendricks couldn't provide specific information about individual clients due to confidentiality requirements, but she was able to confirm that someone matching Emma's description had participated in their programs several years earlier. She was one of the most remarkable people I've ever worked with, Dr. Hendricks said carefully. Intelligent, resilient, dedicated to helping others. She had experienced terrible trauma but had somehow maintained her core identity and her compassion for other victims. The woman Dr. Hendricks described had eventually become a volunteer with the organization, using her understanding of psychological manipulation and cult tactics to help other survivors recover from their experiences. She had been particularly effective at working with people who had been taken as children and had spent years or decades in captivity. She understood the specific challenges of recovering memories and identity after extended psychological conditioning, Dr. Hendricks continued. She could relate to their experiences in ways that even trained therapists sometimes couldn't. Dr. Hendricks agreed to pass along Maya's contact information to her former colleague, along with a message explaining Maya's family connection and the results of the federal investigation. Whether the woman would choose to make contact would be entirely her decision. You have to understand, Dr. Hendricks warned, many survivors of these kinds of experiences never feel completely safe, even years after their escape. The trauma runs very deep, and the fear of being found never entirely goes away. November 2024. Location: Portland, Oregon. Maya returned to Portland to wait and to continue her work as a consultant on the ongoing federal investigation into Circle operations. The arrests and raids had disrupted the organization's activities across multiple states, but agents were still tracking down leads and trying to locate other facilities and captives. The rescue of Jack Reynolds and other survivors from the main sanctuary had generated significant media attention, bringing national focus to the issue of organized child trafficking and cult abuse. Maya had been interviewed by numerous journalists and had appeared on several television programs to discuss her investigation and its results. But despite the public attention and the success of the federal operation, Maya felt incomplete. She had found Jack, but he remained psychologically trapped by decades of conditioning. She had proven that Emma had survived and escaped, but she still didn't know where her cousin was or whether she was safe. The call came on a rainy Tuesday evening in November, just as Maya was finishing dinner in her Portland apartment. The number was blocked, and the voice on the other end was cautious but unmistakably familiar, even after more than 40 years. Maya? This is Emma. Emma Reynolds. I think it's time we talked. Maya's heart pounded as she heard her cousin's voice for the first time since they were children. Emma's voice was older, more careful, but it carried the same intelligence and determination that Maya remembered from their childhood. Emma, Maya whispered, tears streaming down her face. I've been looking for you. We've all been looking for you. The conversation was brief. Emma was still cautious about extended phone calls and potential surveillance. But she agreed to meet Maya in person, choosing a public location where she would feel safe and could leave quickly if necessary. November 2024. Location: Powell's Books, Portland. The meeting was arranged for a Saturday afternoon at Powell's Books, Portland's famous independent bookstore. Emma had chosen the location because it was public but offered numerous exits and places to blend into crowds. She had also specified that Maya should come alone and should not inform anyone else about the meeting in advance. Maya arrived early and positioned herself in the cafe area where she could watch the store's main entrance. She wasn't sure she would recognize Emma after so many years, but when her cousin appeared, the family resemblance was unmistakable despite the changes wrought by time and trauma. Emma Reynolds was now 55 years old, her dark hair streaked with gray and pulled back in a simple ponytail. She moved with the careful awareness of someone who had learned to constantly evaluate her environment for threats. Her clothing was unremarkable: jeans, a sweater, a jacket that could be quickly removed or abandoned if necessary. But her eyes were still the same intelligent, questioning eyes that Maya remembered from their childhood, though they now carried depths of experience that no child should ever have to acquire. Maya, Emma said quietly as she approached the table. You've grown up. The reunion was emotional but subdued, conducted in whispers over coffee as Emma shared fragments of her story and Maya provided updates about their family and the federal investigation that had finally brought down the Circle. I heard about the raids on the news, Emma said. I couldn't believe it was really happening. For years, I thought they were too powerful, too well-connected to ever be stopped. Emma explained that she had been living under an assumed identity for nearly 2 decades, working with various organizations that helped trafficking victims and cult survivors. She had used her knowledge of Circle methods to help law enforcement agencies understand cult psychology and rescue operations. I couldn't use my real name or contact the family directly, Emma said. I wasn't sure who I could trust, and I was afraid that drawing attention to myself might put other survivors at risk. She had followed news coverage of missing children cases over the years, always hoping to see evidence that law enforcement was making progress against organizations like the Circle. When Maya's investigation had begun generating media attention, Emma had realized that someone from her family was finally uncovering the truth. I read every article about your podcast, watched every interview, Emma said. I was so proud of you, but I was also terrified that you were putting yourself in danger. Maya shared the news about Jack's rescue and his current condition, which brought tears to Emma's eyes. She had never stopped hoping that her brother had survived, but she had feared that his young age at the time of their capture would have made him more vulnerable to psychological conditioning. Can I see him? Emma asked. I know he probably won't remember me, but I need to see him. December 2024. Location: Federal Medical Facility, Oregon. The reunion between Emma and Jack Reynolds took place under carefully controlled conditions at the federal medical facility where Jack was receiving treatment. Dr. Foster supervised the meeting, ready to intervene if the encounter proved too traumatic for either sibling. Jack showed no initial recognition when Emma entered the room. To him, she was simply another stranger in a world he didn't understand or trust. But Emma had prepared for this possibility during her years of working with other survivors. "Hello, Jack," she said quietly, sitting across from him in the facility's common room. "I know you don't remember me, but I want you to know that someone loves you. Someone has always loved you, even when you couldn't remember that love existed." Emma didn't push for recognition or try to force Jack to remember their childhood. Instead, she simply talked to him about everyday things: the weather, the books in the room, the view from the window. She shared stories about people who had been through similar experiences and had found ways to heal and recover. Over the course of several visits, Jack gradually became more comfortable with Emma's presence. While he still didn't remember their relationship, he began to respond to something familiar in her voice and manner. "You remind me of someone," Jack told Emma during one of their meetings. "I can't remember who, but it's a good feeling. Safe." Dr. Foster explained that this was a positive sign. Some part of Jack's original personality was responding to Emma even though his conscious memories remained suppressed. With time and patience, it might be possible to help Jack recover more of his authentic self. Recovery is a choice that each survivor has to make for themselves, Dr. Foster told Maya and Emma. "We can provide support and therapy, but Jack will have to decide whether he wants to undertake the difficult work of recovering his suppressed memories." Emma understood this better than anyone. Her own recovery had taken years of careful work to separate her authentic memories from the false narratives the circle had tried to implant. She was prepared to be patient with Jack's process, however long it might take. January 2025. Location: Portland, Oregon. As winter deepened in the Pacific Northwest, Maya and Emma worked together to support Jack's recovery while also continuing their involvement in the ongoing federal investigation. The Circle case had expanded into one of the largest organized crime investigations in recent memory, with connections being uncovered to similar organizations around the world. Emma's testimony had been crucial in helping federal prosecutors understand the full scope of the Circle's operations and the sophisticated methods they had used to maintain control over their captives. Her detailed knowledge of their psychological techniques had also helped other survivors begin their own recovery processes. "There are so many people who need help," Emma told Maya as they reviewed case files at the FBI's Portland office. "People who are still trapped in similar situations, people who escaped but don't know how to rebuild their lives, families who are still searching for missing loved ones." Together, they had begun planning a foundation that would provide support services specifically for survivors of organized trafficking and cult abuse. Emma's experience as both a survivor and a helper would guide the organization's mission, while Maya's investigative skills would help locate and assist other victims. The work was difficult and emotionally draining, but it provided both women with a sense of purpose that helped balance the grief and trauma of their family's experience. They were transforming their pain into action that could prevent other families from suffering the same losses. Jack's progress was slow but steady. With Emma's patient support and Dr. Foster's therapeutic guidance, he had begun to show flickers of recognition and memory. The process was complicated by the sophisticated conditioning he had undergone, but there were signs that his original personality was beginning to emerge from beneath the artificial identity the Circle had constructed. "Some days he calls me Emma," she told Maya. "Other days I'm still just a stranger. But I can see him fighting to remember, and that gives me hope." March 2025. Location: Willow Creek, Oregon. On a bright spring morning exactly 43 years and 5 months after Emma and Jack Reynolds had disappeared from Willowbrook Park, Maya Collins stood with her cousin Emma at the base of the old oak tree where the scorched photograph album had first been found. The park looked much the same as it had in 1981, though the trees were taller and the underbrush thicker. A small memorial plaque had been installed near the oak tree, dedicated to the children who were lost and the families who never stopped searching. "I never thought I'd see this place again," Emma said quietly, her hand resting on the rough bark of the ancient tree. "When they first took us, I kept thinking about this spot, about the path home, about whether anyone would know to look for us here." The town of Willow Creek had struggled to come to terms with the revelation that one of the most notorious criminal organizations in American history had operated from within their community for decades. Some residents felt guilt that they had not recognized the signs or done more to investigate the disappearances. Others felt anger that their town's reputation had been tarnished by events beyond their control. But there had also been healing. Support groups had been established for families affected by the Circle's activities. The elementary school had implemented new safety programs and counseling services. Most importantly, the community had learned to talk openly about difficult truths rather than maintaining the silence that had allowed the Circle to operate undetected. Maya's investigation had ultimately uncovered evidence of more than 200 victims of circle activities spanning 5 decades. While many had been rescued and reunited with their families, others remained missing or had died in captivity. The full scope of the organization's crimes would probably never be completely understood. But Emma and Jack Reynolds had survived, and their survival had made it possible to finally bring justice to their captors and rescue dozens of other victims. Their story had become a symbol of resilience and hope for other families dealing with similar tragedies. Jack wants to visit here soon, Emma told Maya as they prepared to leave the park. Dr. Foster thinks it might help him recover more memories. He's been asking questions about our childhood, about the day we disappeared. The recovery process was ongoing for all the survivors, but particularly for those like Jack who had been taken as young children. Some would never fully recover their original personalities, but many were making remarkable progress with proper support and therapy. Emma had decided to settle permanently in the Pacific Northwest, where she could continue her work with survivors while rebuilding her relationship with her family. Maya had taken a leave of absence from journalism to focus on the foundation they were establishing together. June 2025. Location: Reynolds Family Foundation, Portland. The Reynolds Family Foundation officially opened its doors on June 15, 2025, in a converted warehouse in Portland's Pearl District. The organization's mission was to provide comprehensive support services for survivors of organized trafficking, cult abuse, and similar forms of systematic psychological manipulation. Emma served as the Foundation's Director of Survivor Services, drawing on her decades of experience both as a survivor and as someone who had helped others recover from similar trauma. Maya handled research and investigation services, helping families locate missing relatives and supporting law enforcement agencies in understanding cult psychology and tactics. The Foundation's opening ceremony was attended by federal officials, local politicians, and dozens of survivors from various trafficking and cult situations. It represented not just a new organization, but a new approach to addressing the complex needs of people who had been subjected to systematic psychological abuse. For too long, survivors of these crimes have been forced to heal in isolation, Emma said during her opening remarks. We want to create a community where people can support each other through the recovery process and where families can find the resources they need to rebuild their relationships. Jack Reynolds attended the ceremony, his first major public appearance since his rescue. While he still struggled with memory gaps and the ongoing effects of his conditioning, he had made remarkable progress in recovering his original personality. He had even begun volunteering with the Foundation, helping other survivors understand that recovery was possible even after decades of captivity. I don't remember everything about my life before, Jack said during a brief speech at the ceremony. But I know that I was loved, and I know that people never stopped looking for me. That knowledge has given me the strength to keep fighting to remember who I really am. The Foundation's work quickly expanded beyond the Pacific Northwest as word spread about their innovative approaches to survivor support. They began consulting with law enforcement agencies across the country, helping with rescue operations and providing training on the psychological needs of trafficking survivors. Emma and Maya also continued their work documenting the full scope of the Circle's operations, ensuring that the history of the organization and its victims would be preserved for future researchers and law enforcement professionals. October 2025. Location: Willow Creek Memorial Garden. On the 44th anniversary of Emma and Jack's disappearance, the town of Willow Creek dedicated a memorial garden in Willowbrook Park, honoring all the victims of the Blackwood Circle and celebrating the survivors who had found their way home. The ceremony was attended by hundreds of people, including survivors from across the country, family members of victims, law enforcement officials who had worked on the case, and community members who wanted to show their support for the healing process. Emma and Jack Reynolds spoke at the ceremony, sharing their story and their message of hope for other families dealing with similar tragedies. Their presence at the memorial represented not just their personal survival, but the triumph of truth over secrecy and love over fear. The people who took us believed that they could erase our identities and destroy our connections to our families, Emma said as she addressed the crowd. They were wrong. Love is stronger than fear. Truth is more powerful than lies. And the human spirit cannot be permanently broken no matter how much suffering it endures. Maya stood with her cousins as they unveiled the memorial's centerpiece, a sculpture depicting children holding hands in an unbroken circle, with an inscription reading, "To those we lost, to those we found, and to those still searching for home. The investigation into the Blackwood Circle had officially concluded, but the work of healing and recovery would continue for years to come. Maya's podcast about the case had become a landmark in true crime journalism, but more importantly, it had given voice to survivors and families who had been silenced for decades. The story of Emma and Jack Reynolds had begun with tragedy and loss, but it had ended with justice, reunion, and hope. Their survival had made it possible to rescue dozens of other victims and to expose a criminal network that had operated in darkness for far too long. As the sun set over Willow Creek on that October evening, Maya Collins stood with her cousins and felt the profound satisfaction of a story finally told in full. The missing children of 1981 had found their way home at last, and their journey had lit a path for others still searching in the darkness. The echoes of their voices would continue to resonate, ensuring that no child would disappear into silence again without someone fighting to bring them back into the light. Epilogue. December 2025. Location: Maya's Portland apartment. Maya Collins sat before her microphone one final time, preparing to record the epilogue to her groundbreaking podcast series, Whispers of the Circle. The original investigation had consumed nearly 2 years of her life and had fundamentally changed not just her understanding of her family's tragedy, but her entire approach to journalism and justice. This is Maya Collins with the final update on the Blackwood Circle investigation. She said into the microphone, "It's been 4 years since I first discovered the scorched photograph album in my aunt's attic, and 18 months since Operation Daybreak brought down one of the most sophisticated criminal organizations in American history." She paused, looking at the photographs that covered her office walls. Images of rescued survivors, federal agents, memorial ceremonies, and most importantly, recent pictures of Emma and Jack Reynolds as they continued their recovery and their work with other survivors. "The numbers tell part of the story," Maya continued. 247 victims identified across 5 decades. 63 people rescued from active captivity. 17 Circle facilities shut down across 4 countries. But numbers can't capture the human cost of what we uncovered, or the remarkable resilience of the people who survived it. Maya's investigation had ultimately revealed that the Blackwood Circle was part of a global network of organizations engaged in systematic human trafficking, psychological manipulation, and what intelligence agencies had termed social control experimentation. The connections extended to government contractors, academic institutions, and legitimate businesses that had unknowingly provided cover for criminal activities. Emma Reynolds continues to serve as Director of Survivor Services at the Reynolds Family Foundation, Maya reported. She has helped more than 200 survivors begin their recovery process and has consulted with law enforcement agencies around the world on cult rescue operations. Jack Reynolds has recovered significant portions of his original memories, though he continues to work with therapists to separate authentic experiences from the false narratives implanted during his captivity. He now serves as a peer counselor with the foundation and has become a powerful advocate for survivor rights. Maya's own life had been profoundly changed by the investigation. She had left traditional journalism to focus entirely on her work with the foundation and her ongoing research into organized trafficking networks. The work was difficult and often heartbreaking, but it provided a sense of purpose that transcended conventional career success. To the families still searching for missing loved ones, to the survivors still finding the courage to speak their truth, and to the law enforcement officers working to dismantle these networks, your work matters, your voices matter, and you are not alone, Maya concluded. The Blackwood Circle believed that darkness was stronger than light, that fear was more powerful than love, and that some secrets could be buried forever. They were wrong on every count. Maya turned off the recording equipment and sat back in her chair, feeling the weight of completion settle over her. The investigation that had begun with a scorched photograph album had become one of the most significant criminal cases of the 21st century, but more importantly, it had brought her family home. Outside her window, Portland's winter rain tapped against the glass like the gentle whisper of voices finally free to speak their truth. Emma and Jack Reynolds had found their way back to the light, and their journey had illuminated a path for countless others still searching for home. The echoes of their story would continue to resonate, ensuring that no child would disappear into silence again without someone fighting to bring them back where they belonged.